Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Aging Less, the Longevity Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Marie Stella, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together. Hello and welcome back to the show. Today we're exploring the topic of how we don't simply exist in the world, but we really live through a particular perception of the world, the way we view what life is, what people are, what the future holds, and so much more. All of this quietly sculpts the way we experience stress, satisfaction, and ultimately our health across time. So if you're prone to getting stressed, stay tuned because in this episode, we're joined by certified mindfulness teacher and researcher, Kathirasan K, to learn more about how our worldview shapes our stress, well-being, and longevity. He is also the founder and CEO of the Center for Mindfulness Singapore and Mindfulness Academy Global. So together, we're also going to be looking at practical ways to manage our stress through mindfulness. And we're extremely fortunate to have Kathirasan here with us today. So welcome to the show.
Thank you for the warm welcome, Marie. Very excited to be here and looking forward to our conversation today.
Yeah, I'm really excited too. But before we begin, tell us a bit about your background and what compelled you to pursue mindfulness as a career.
That's a very interesting question because I made a decision in 2014-15 to make mindfulness my career. And at that time, I founded the Center for Mindfulness Singapore in 2015, primarily because of my experience being in a corporate environment for 18 years and already being a mindfulness practitioner and seeing its benefits, emerging in the way that I related with my colleagues, with my vendors, with my associates in my corporate life. And one of the things that really inspired me is the kind of results that I saw within and also without. Like I felt that mindfulness helped me stay focused and also create very meaningful and very purposeful relationships with my colleagues as well as other stakeholders. And that inspired me to do what I'm doing right now and eventually start the Center for Mindfulness Singapore so that more people around the globe could benefit the what I call the practice benefits of mindfulness.
Yeah, that's an exceptional story. And I'm also really curious to know throughout your time building this mindfulness practice and teaching mindfulness to people, what's a common misconception that you've heard about stress and longevity?
One of the perhaps very much validated and much spoken about misconception is the concept of positive stress, or sometimes called as eustress. And people say that positive stress is good. Yeah, that's a big misconception in my opinion, because to me, any form of stress is not healthy if it is prolonged, including positive stress.
Wow, really? So, what would you say is like a more healthy alternative to that, misinformed idea of positive stress that we have?
I think that the key thing is to understand stress first before even concluding that positive stress is something that is going to be helpful or it is even valid. So the fact that we don't inquire into the human experience often and we remain distracted from such inquiry or self-inquiry, and that is one of the key things that could actually contribute to a more sustained well-being.
Yeah, for sure. I think like that lack of self-inquiry is the key point there because a lot of us well, I make sure to do it in my own time, but from what I've seen with friends or even family, um, our priorities in life we're so focused on them rather than like thinking about how we view the world, or that the piece that you mentioned. So yeah, I think that's a wonderful preface for our topic for today. But before we go further into detail, I would love to get to know you better. So this is Have You Met Kathirasan? And my first question for you is, what is your favorite book?
My favorite book, especially I'm talking about the book in English because I do read books in other languages. But my favorite English book, which has been my favorite for a couple of decades, is actually Jonathan Livingston Seagull by Richard Mark, and that happens to be my favorite book. Timeless, yeah.
Yeah. So give me an elevator pitch. Like, what is it that you think is so great about this book, and why do you think people should read it?
This book is very interesting because it's about seagulls, but of course it is it's a very metaphorical book. And one thing I love about this book is that it actually presents the human experience, because there are there is a popular view, and then there are unpopular views, and usually the people who subscribe to popular views tend to disregard unpopular views, something that is actually not the what I call the cookie cutter approaches to living, and also finding solutions to life's problems. And we tend to not look at that. And sometimes we also think that everything has to be empirically validated, which is something that philosophers continuously challenge. So this book talks about the path that is least traveled, the ways of living that we don't usually think about. And in that sense, the primary character in the book, it would become ostracized for taking the path that is least traveled. But that path could be sometimes be groundbreaking or even game changing. And that's what this book is all about. So I love that book because it also kind of reflects my own journey as well. So I see
Yeah.
myself in the book sometimes. I feel so good just reading it.
Yeah, just from the sounds of it, I relate to it from the sense of like, quite literally, I don't like taking the path most traveled by, because you know what, like that's a big crowd and that's a lot of people around me. Right. Um, but my next question for you is, what movie have you enjoyed recently?
Yeah, there was one book that really was very riveting. One particular movie or limited series that was particularly very riveting for me was Adolescence. Now that particular movie was fantastic. I really enjoyed it because I think that it represents the human condition that we also
Yeah.
sometimes don't even think about, and we take it for granted. And after watching the movie, we might even forget about it. It is possible for us to go through such a life as a parent or as the child or as a sibling. It's all possible.
Yeah, I definitely do like need to take the human experience a lot more with a lot more gratitude. But tell us a bit more about the synopsis of this movie and what the premise is.
Now, this movie, I think the thing that I really found very helpful is that here we have parents who are living that normal life, a father who works very hard, a mom who takes care of her kids, and then here comes the son who happened to commit a murder. And then you see, we can't imagine, right? May not be the perfect family, but we cannot imagine the perfect family having an adolescent, a teenager who had committed murder. We just cannot connect the dots. Now, that is actually this such an expectation is unreasonable, actually, because anything could happen anytime, and a personality is not born entirely out of upbringing. There are so many other factors that we cannot control. And I think this movie depicts that we think that everything is predictable. We believe that everything can be controlled. But the fact is, you and I can't even predict our next thought.
Yeah,
Now, that's
exactly.
what life is. So this movie is so it's great because it tells us that that this sense of predictability that we look for and we expect out of the world is actually an unreasonable expectation. In fact, in my view, that's one of the causes of stress.
Yeah, that's a really good recommendation you have right there. And what about podcasts? Are there any that you're listening to at the moment?
No, I'm not a fan of podcasts, to be honest. I'm a reader. I love reading books.
That's okay. We won't take any offense. Um, yeah, I mean, like, listening to podcasts isn't for everybody for sure. But you've made some really good recommendations already, so I'll leave it there. Won't bother you any further with that. What about role models? And anyone that you've looked up to, either professionally or personally?
Not really. I do not. I used to have role models in the early part of my life. Now, as I matured, I found that I do not have role models anymore, but I have role models in specific spheres. Like, for example, I look up to my late dad. I look up to my mom. I look up to my wife. There are so many people that I look up to because they are. There is no one. I realize that there is no one person who's good at everything. Yeah, there is always somebody seems to be good at something. So there are so many role models in my life, and not particularly one. I can like create a long list, and I feel that we can learn from anyone and everyone. Actually, to be honest, that's what I've learned over my own, what I call reflective inquiry and from my own gratitude practices. I realized there's so much to learn from possibly anyone that I meet.
Yeah, for sure. That's exactly what makes us all unique is that, we're not all striving to be one singular thing. Otherwise we'd all just be like the same person, which like what's the point in that, right? Now my last question for you is, has there been a course or class that you've taken that has stuck with you to this date?
Yes, and that is not a structured course per se, but I spent about 4 years learning philosophy from a monk from the Himalayan tradition. And that happens to my first teacher, actually, with whom I spent, like I said, 4 years studying mindfulness, Sanskrit-based philosophy, Indian philosophy, and the way of looking at the world. That's my first classical training in mindfulness back in the 90s. And I still remember that very fondly because the course wasn't structured. It was so loose. It was through, of course, through text as well as through an interactive dialogue, and that really transformed the way I looked at the world, which is something that you mentioned. That's the topic of today, worldview. It radically changed and transformed my worldview, and therefore that course remains in my memory. It's etched in my memory, and I remember those like 4 years very, very fondly.
Yeah, I was going to ask you what the biggest lessons are that you've learned from this course, but given that it's so close in proximity to exactly what we're talking about today, I'll leave it to later in the episode for you to bring in anecdotally if you wish. So let's get started on the on getting into how worldview shapes our stress and well-being. But for starters, how would you define longevity? How would you define stress?
Now, I'm not going to give a textbook definition. I'm going to perhaps present an aspect of how I see. Now, when we look at longevity, I think it's primarily related to the body. It is body-centered, right? It's a typical question. How longevity is something that revolves around the lifespan of a person. That's how I look at longevity.
And what about stress?
Now, stress is actually a response that happens to demands, challenges, and threats, and usually, not all the time, stress is a mental. It starts as a mental phenomenon before it manifests it in the body. So there is bodily stress, there is mental stress, but between the two, what is perhaps a good way to appreciate stress is that it starts with the mind, because even bodily stress gets interpreted through the mind.
Yeah, and to add to that, how would you describe the relationship between stress and longevity?
So there is evidence to show that actually people who are less stressed tend to have longer lives. They live longer lives. They have longer lives. And people who are very stressed, they tend to have shorter lives. So there is a correlation between stress and longevity. I think it's very much it's already known, and it's already what I call, we have a very strong evidence base for that correlation.
Yeah. And when we talk about worldview in today's episode, what would we be referring to exactly?
Yeah, so I would define worldview as the way we see the self, others, and the world, and the interconnection between all of these components. So that is how I look at worldview. It's a way of looking at yourself, is the way we look at others, and the way we look at the world. And there is a connection between among all these three components, and that's worldview.
Yeah. And is there like some sort of way to classify the various types of worldview just really broadly? Do they have some kind of evidential like connection to how it affects the way we get stressed, our health?
Yeah, that's a good question, because you see, when it comes to worldviews, there are usually typically different types of worldviews. We can categorize worldviews into religious worldviews, spiritual worldviews, empirical worldviews, philosophical worldviews, scientific, etc. So and so forth. So there are many different categories or types of worldviews. So you can see easily the worldview that we subscribe to tend to influence the way we live our lives and how we even process stress and stressors. So, for example, if I see myself as a limited being, then I would take stress as something that is normal. It's a norm. It's normal for me to experience stress. But if I think that I'm a superhuman, if that's my worldview, then I think that stress cannot be accepted as a human experience, because I've assumed or believe that I'm a superhuman. So in the same way, if I think that the world is perfect, then if I think the world is perfect, therefore I cannot expect or accept anything that is opposite to perfect. Now you can see, what does this mean? All of these worldviews lead to one particular important phenomenon in us, which is expectations. Now, worldviews create expectations because worldviews shape the way we process our human experience and what we expect from the world. For example, if we think that people should be at their best and they should always be perfect. Now, what would happen is I would expect a perfect response, an ideal response, or an expected or anticipated response from everyone. And what happens? I'm going to be very, very unhappy because I can't control everyone else and how they respond to their experience. So you can see worldview has a significant impact on the way we process stress and the way we receive and even accept or respond to stress.
Yeah, those are some really, really good examples. And, I can think of several instances in my life where I, inadvertently have expected something the outcome of something to be perfect, or the way someone responds to me to be perfect. But the way I think about it is like, well, that's not perfect. That's just, acceptable, right? And then from there I get annoyed at something, and then it persists, like the rumination persists, and I like get so frustrated. Why isn't this person doing this thing that they're supposed to be doing? But then also, like, my mind is kind of fixating on that one like instance of something happening and not really thinking about the larger picture of like what this person was intending to do, what this person's experience is, why they reacted a certain way, why they did things a certain way, right? So could you tell us a bit more about how the way that we think, I suppose the way we think about like with fixating on this one particular instance, for example, versus thinking about broader picture, what this, like, who this person is, viewing this person as just a person rather than perfect, and how that might affect the way we react from it.
Yeah. Again, I think that's a very practical question, because we have problems, like all of us, including myself. We have something that is called a fixation. Now, we tend to get attached to a particular perspective and we cannot let go of that perspective. I believe that's what you're talking about, Marie. Am I right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a conventional challenge we all have, because we tend to be attached to a particular perspective and we cannot see other perspectives, like tunnel vision. We have that challenge. Now, that has got nothing to do with the wisdom that we may possess, but it has got to do more with the mental texture or as I call, the strength of the texture of the mind that contributes a kind of a cognitive flexibility, as I would call it. Now, what is cognitive flexibility? The ability to let go of a perspective and attach to another perspective, and also let go of that perspective and attach to another perspective. Now, that's a kind of cognitive flexibility. So, more than what I know, right, I could know a lot of things. And like, for example, I know that going to the gym is good, but whether I go to the gym is entirely a different question. So I have the value that I need to do something or I should not do something. But me adhering to that value and taking an action is entirely a different subject. And this is where mindfulness comes into the picture, because the mind may not have that strength to execute or to take action or to shift perspective, which is what I meant to refer to as cognitive flexibility. And that is entirely a different domain of training. So there is one type of training where I gain knowledge and wisdom, which is what we're very good at, actually, because in this modern world, information is abundant. We can easily subscribe to and get access to information. But what we don't have is the capacity or the possibility and the opportunity to train the mind to shift that perspective, to be more flexible, so that I can let go of a perspective and look at a perhaps more helpful perspective. And that actually relates to something that you spoke about, which is rumination, because rumination is about fixation, because it's like a repeat performance. I remember in my early years going to bed, someone, said something about me, and I go to bed and I kind of let go of that thought. The more I resist it, it persists. And it took me years of practice to actually cultivate that cognitive flexibility, to be able to drop and insightfully, as well as through training, to let go of that perspective. And you know what? Having good sleep. So these days, to be honest, I enjoy very, very good sleep, because when I go to bed, I let go.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, going to bed is also a way of like, when you have dreams, you process things as well. You wake up, I personally, I can't speak for everyone, but I personally feel a lot better whenever I go to sleep, I process things and I wake up. But I'm also really curious to know, because we talked a little bit about our perception of the world, perception of situations that we go through, and then cognitive flexibility. I'm curious to know what the various factors are that like contribute to someone's ability to be cognitively flexible.
Yeah. So one of there are three aspects to that training. I would use the word training because it is training. It's like going to the gym, but just that this is a mental gym. So how do we achieve that cognitive flexibility? So there are 3 A's that I speak about when it comes to the cultivation of cognitive flexibility. The first one is attentional training. That means to be able to place our attention on a particular point over a period of time or length of time. That is called the attentional training, sustaining attention on a particular object of attention. The second one is acceptance training. Now, acceptance training is the cultivation of not resisting an experience, but allowing the experience to just be. So psychologists and mindfulness researchers call that open monitoring, meaning that you're open to experience. Because as you know, if I were to ask a person to not think of an elephant, they would think of an elephant, right? What we resist persists. So the second is acceptance training, training the mind to be able to open to all experiences, which also leads to response mechanism as opposed to the reactive tendencies. So that's the second type, acceptance training. The third A is awareness training. Now, awareness training is about decentering from the experience. Instead of being enmeshed and being involved in the experience, we start to learn to be a witness to the experience, witness to all experiences, for the matter. So these are the 3 types of what I call conscious cultivation that helps us to strengthen our ability to be cognitively flexible.
Right. It kind of sounds like, forgive my lack of better phrasing, but it kind of sounds like just like training yourself to be a side character. Just like, yep, I am just a side character in this. Like,
Yes.
that's all right with me. I'm just witnessing this moment, like, yeah, I'm just adjacent to this situation and I can't really do anything because this is how life goes. So I'm
Yep.
just going to witness this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I want to add something because sometimes people tell me, like, not that I'm saying it's not a colloquial thing, or we do this we do this conventionally, but however, instead of saying I'm angry, I could say I'm noticing anger. Now, that this just that just presenting it in from this perspective shifts the way we look at our experience. Like when I say I am angry, because the word M is like mathematically is like equal. So when I say I am angry, I have identified with that anger, but my fingers aren't angry, my toes aren't angry. But we have colloquially validated, right? But there is this implicit association of anger with the whole self. But when I say I'm noticing anger, as you said, it's like a side character now, right? I'm now observing anger, standing apart from it. And the moment I stand apart from it, I gain a greater degree of mastery over what I am noticing compared to what I identify with.
Yeah, it's the idea of like, I am more than just what's happening to like in my life right now. But I'm also curious to know, on the other hand, toxic positivity has become a more popular point of discourse over the last few years. And not to say that this is toxic positivity at all, but I would like to know what the difference is between toxic positivity and a, healthy longevity supporting kind of worldview.
Yeah, this is also a topic that I'm quite what I call interested especially I talk about this in when I train mindfulness teachers at the teachers in training at the academy, which is something that you have very accurately pointed out: toxic positivity versus positivity. Now, what is toxic positivity? Let me illustrate this. Now, imagine you have a glass with filled with half filled with water, right? So there are two ways of looking at it. One way of looking at it is the glass is half empty, which is considered to be the pessimistic view. And the other perspective is seeing the glass as half full. That is called the optimistic way of looking. So, what is toxic positivity? Trying to to force oneself to look at this glass as being half full all the time, and not being able to accept that there is a possibility of looking at this particular glass of water as being half empty. Now, that is toxic positivity, as I call it, because we cannot always take the view that there is only one way of looking at this particular glass of water. But I always say there is a third perspective, actually. You know what that is? It's a glass of water, regardless of whether it's half full or whether it is full. Now, that is what I call as the mindfulness perspective. It's just a glass of water. So that is a very objective way of looking at that particular experience. So toxic positivity is when we think that there is only one way of looking at it and trying to find the most optimistic way of looking at it all the time. I want to qualify here. It is very helpful to look at our experiences in a very optimistic way in our life, but it cannot be transformed in a way that we end up becoming a polemic or end up polarizing, right, our discourse when it comes to processing or interpreting our life experience. It's good to have three perspectives:
Yeah.
optimistic, the pessimistic, and the objective, what it is.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I think, which is that toxic positivity is kind of like a like lack of acknowledgement of negative feelings whatsoever. Even if you might be experiencing those negative emotions, you don't really want to acknowledge that. You want to like materialize the more positive ones and always just look on the bright side of things. Whereas, being more mindful is more about like more about neutrality. Like, if you're experiencing a negative emotion, you name it and you say it. You just I suppose you try to give it less power. Yeah.
That's right.
That's good to know. So Is it ever too late to shift your worldview? Like if you do it later, would you have to put in more work to do it?
I don't think so, because I realized that there is an there is an advantage to shift worldviews in our, probably in our early part of our life, and also possibly in later part of our life. Now I'll tell you why. Now, if we start cultivating this skill early in life, yeah, we get a head start. And that's the advantage, right? Having a head start. But if we were to do it much later in our lives, it gets better in a different way. We had enough life experiences to process, which which may not be there for someone who starts this cultivating this skill early in life. So to me, it's never too late, actually, because whenever you start consciously cultivating this skill, that moment is the right moment. I always say this because at that point, when a person has that realization, that is the right moment. It's that present moment is a gift. So we could cultivate this skill at any point in our lives. It doesn't matter how young or how old we are. If we are old, great, full of life experiences. If we are young, great, head start. Yeah.
Yeah. And what's one belief that you've either embraced or relinquished, one that's, changed your own peace of mind or mental health?
It is one of the things that radically changed my worldview, as well as how I started to live my life, is to inquire into my self nature. Now, which is something that we don't usually do, but I've got this. I'm very I'm very grateful that I've started to think about this very early in my life, to investigate and inquire into my own nature after reading a very beautiful line attributed to Socrates, that the unexamined life is not worth living. So that particular quote, the unexamined life is not worth living. Now that really kind of struck me, and it really awakened me to want to investigate into what is life. But the whole point is not about life. Who is the person who is experiencing the so-called life? It's me. So if there is one thing that I wanted to really understand, and among all the other things out in the world, actually, is the observer, is the perceiver, is the person who is receiving. I am the container of all experiences, but I end up investigating into the experience instead of the container. So that shift had radically changed the way I live, because I started to see it from my perspective, from others' perspective, and how it impacts the world. That's why I mentioned earlier, worldview comprises of the self, others, and the world. I started to look at things from three perspectives, because a lot of times what I've noticed is, before this so-called shift, I used to sometimes look at things solely from others' perspectives, and that led me to judge myself. And 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 when I look at it from the world's perspective, I started to see how my action impacts the world. This includes small things like recycling, making the world more sustainable, the big stuff. Now, if I don't look at it from that perspective, then I'm not contributing to the world. Then if I solely took the perspective of the self, then I become narcissistic. Now, there is a risk of becoming narcissistic if I took solely my perspectives. But the most important thing is that I've noticed is, we tend to look at others' perspectives, we investigate into the world, but we neglect the inquiry into self-nature. So understanding self-nature without understanding others and the world can lead to narcissism. But the moment we infuse the inquiry into the self in our quest for knowledge, and living consciously, then it becomes a very balanced life. And that's what I learned very not very early, but I remember in the 90s, when I learned this from my teacher. And I started to inquire, and all the books that I started to read from various philosophical traditions, different cultures, and all of them led me to see this value and to create this shift. Is it starts with the self, but it doesn't end there. It starts with the self, and then it goes out and it creates very meaningful relationships with others as well as the world.
Yeah. So what's one piece of advice you give to anyone who is hoping to change their worldview or their perception a little bit in an effort to relieve some stress?
Yeah. I'm not a fan of giving advice, but I understand where you're coming from. I would say that rather, I would say it's an invitation. All right. I would say that I would invite people who are watching this or listening to this or reading this to start directing a part of their energy to watching their own emotions, watching their behaviors, watching their thoughts. And this can be cultivated through, as I said, three types of training: attentional training, acceptance training, and awareness training. That's an invitation that I would like to offer.
Yeah, I just imagine myself doing this and like watching myself do certain things and going like, wow, that's cringe. You should stop that. I don't know. Like, has there ever been like a point where someone accidentally gets overly critical of themselves?
Yeah.
What's the line?
Yeah. So the line is now people would get, I am very likely to be critical of myself if I only cultivated attentional training. Now, that's the reason why there is acceptance training. Acceptance training is the one that diffuses self-criticism and judgment. Acceptance training cultivates non-judgment. And that's why the second A of the three A's, right? It's very critical, because when I cultivate acceptance, then I bring self-compassion. I bring compassion into the mix. And therefore, there is no opportunity, rather, to be what I call to be judgmental of oneself in that sense. Absolutely.
Right.
That's why there's a second A over there, which is acceptance training.
I'd have to actually set up like a system where like I get punished for not showing myself self-compassion or something like that. And is that something that would work, or are there like more like better like passive ways to do it?
Yeah. So I would say that I would always challenge this particular thinking that we need to be punished, because if you look at our lives, we were once punished.
Yeah, look, I grew up in Singapore. Like, punishment is what I was known.
Tell me about that.
Discipline is, right?
So, punishment is like, for me, what I call punitive measures. It has its place. I will not deny it. But the point is, why would I want to look at that as the first response? Right?
Yeah.
So I always say, punishment, maybe it may work for a certain, what I call, set of personalities. But when I look at myself, why do I need to punish myself? Why can't I look at other ways of actually restoring my optimal level of life, in different ways? And that's why I would say that one of the best ways to receive myself in moments where I've not lived up to my own what I call expectations, is only one thing that I would say: compassion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. Receive myself with compassion. If it's so easy to extend compassion to others, but it's so difficult to extend compassion to oneself. Why? Because of something that you alluded to earlier, Marie, which is we are very, very critical of ourselves, because a lot of times these criticisms come from the perspectives of the world, of us, or others of us. Yeah, as much as there is some value in it, but let us not forget that we are all very simple human beings. And the moment we create a worldview for ourselves, we raise our expectations, and we raise the expectations of not the world, of ourselves, in terms of what we expect from the world. So that's very important. Compassion is so critical, but it's so difficult. I must admit. And it starts with practice. That's why I said something that we just spoke about. Acceptance training has a huge impact on how we bring compassion into our human experience.
Yeah, thank you very much for humoring my questions. I have learned a lot to be clear, but I think that would be a really good time to dive into the more day to day application of what you've just shared with us, the more practical sides of things. I would love to tackle this on two fronts. So first, I'm going to do more general, and then I'm going to do a little bit more specific. So let's start out with what habits you'd recommend practicing to manage stress, just very generally.
Now, the first type, the first two ways that we manage stress. Number one is through insight. Insight is actually wisdom or knowledge. Now, the second is through practice. All right. So now let me talk about the first one. The first one is insight, meaning that we need to understand stress. I spoke about that right at the beginning of this, the early part of this session. Now, we need to understand that stress has another component, which is the stressor. Where is that stress coming from? Now, sometimes the stress may not be coming from within. It could be certain things outside of us, policies, systemic, what I call factors that could create a lot of stress. We cannot deny it. So there is a stressor. And then that stressor causes the experience of stress within me. But we often think that as long as I manage my internal stress, the stressor goes away. That is a misconception. So we need to also, when understanding about stress, we need to be aware that the stressor may not be in my control. Now, that insight is very powerful. Now, the second element that I want to talk about with respect to insight is stress is always centered on a role. It is not centered on your life. For example, if I feel stressed at work, then it is the role of an employee that is stressed, not the role of the son or the husband or the father that is being stressed. So stress is always centered on a role. So we need to understand that stress is confined to a role, but when we don't have that insight, you know what happens? The employee who is stressed comes home and becomes the father or the husband or the son who is stressed. And what happens? He then spreads and creates more stress. So
Yeah.
that's a very important insight. We don't see it. So all stress is centered on a role. Even if it is like, for example, new mothers, right? They get stressed sometimes due to being a mother. That stress is centered on the role of being a mother. But the moment there is no insight that is centered on the role, what happens? The wife now gets stressed. The role of the wife now, it spills over. So this is something that is very important, which is to contain. We contain that the stress by understanding through insight that stress is connected to a role. It can be confined to the role, and when we know that, we can then take appropriate measures to manage and support that role. Through within and without as well. So that's the insight dimension.
Yeah.
The second dimension is practice. Now, to reduce stress, we always use coping techniques, which is what we have learned from the world of psychology and therapy, which is always finding coping techniques. To me, that is the least effective. Not that it's not effective, but the least effective. The most effective ways to handle stress is to cultivate what I call the resilience even before I get stressed. Now, this is where I repeat again, which is the mindfulness training, attentional training, acceptance training, awareness training. All of that could be cultivated during peacetime so that you can handle it during wartime. So a lot of times we are taught to think about a solution during wartime. And I always say this, it is impossible to learn swimming when drowning.
That's so true.
Yes. If I want to learn swimming, I got to learn it when I'm okay, not when I'm drowning. So we think about swimming when we are drowning. It's too late. Hopefully it's not, but it's too late to learn swimming when I'm drowning, right? So how do we do this practice? So cultivate that strength, cultivate that ability to be mentally resilient to stress during peacetime when things are okay. Because when things are okay, we are usually distracted. That's the usual thing, right? We look for opportunities to enjoy our lives. But let's not forget that it's during peacetime that we train and keep ourselves resilient for wartime.
Yeah. And what habits would you recommend practicing to shift our perception of the world?
So, again, number one, self-inquiry. Inquire into your experience. Ask yourself, what is it that I'm experiencing? Something that you mentioned earlier, Marie, which is like labeling that emotion. For example, talking about sharing about what you're thinking without judgment, right? Inviting your own self to reflect and think about what is it that we're experiencing. That's a self-inquiry, and so inquiring into what, why, how, etc., and all of that. That's one way. Now, the other way is to perhaps put in place an opportunity for you to practice for about 5 minutes of meditation or mindfulness every day. So basically, to summarize, like a daily practice of mindfulness, meditation for just 5 minutes. And people have this misconception that when I talk about mindfulness or meditation, it's an closed eyes affair, not necessarily for it to be so. It can also be mindful movement or mindful walking or mindful eating. Now, all of that are opportunities. If I could start embedding a 5-minute practice every day into my lives, now that's a very good start. People always think that I got to sit for a 30-minute meditation or I got to do a 30-minute mindfulness practice. No, that's actually too much. I think a way to start is just 5 minutes. If you could just set aside 5 minutes for any type of mindfulness practice, seated, eyes open, movement, and all the different varieties that we have, that could be possibly a very good start.
Yeah. So enlighten us a little bit more about mindful walking, mindful eating. What exactly would we be looking to accomplish when we're mindfully doing these things?
Yeah. So every mindfulness practice cultivates awareness, attention, and acceptance. Yeah, so that's what we're doing. So even when you're walking mindfully, of course, someone could rely on audio guides. The good news is today you can have lots of YouTube videos and mindfulness apps that may have this practice called mindful walking or walking meditation, as they would sometimes call it. Now you can just play that in the background and just follow the guidance. So you walk mindfully. Or there is also mindful eating. There are also guidance available, audio, video. You eat mindfully. So there are different ways of doing this, but all of them would revolve around the 3 A's: attention, acceptance, and awareness. So you could choose anything that kind of floats your boat. It's very important to choose a practice that works for you, instead of trying to look for that perfect practice. No, we need to find a practice that aligns with your being, that sits well with your being. When we choose a practice like that, then there is this stickability, right? It sticks. Otherwise, it doesn't stick.
Yeah. Are you able to share some examples of, like lesser known mindfulness practices? Like, for example, would mindful people watching work,
Yeah. So if you look at mindful people watching, is part of a bigger practice called mindful perception. Basically, what we're doing is we are bringing mindfulness to the stimuli through the 5 sensory organs. So when you see people watching, is eyes. So what you could do is you could look around, and then as your eyes fall on objects or people, what happens? There could be a judgment arising, right? So you notice it, and then you notice that judgment, and then you continue watching. So that is one way of actually practicing. And then you shift your attention now to hearing. Now, while you are seated, you could now direct the attention to your sense of hearing. What are the sounds that you are hearing, and which direction is it coming from? Now, and so forth. You can then shift it to all your 5 sense organs. Yeah, that is one way of doing it. Yeah, people do not know that. So if you're commuting, right, for example, provided not when you're driving, if you're commuting and you are seated, you could do that. Watch, hear, taste, smell, touch, all of that. You could practice it.
That's wonderful because I have about 40 minutes of commute every time I come into the office. So I'll use that time wisely and I'll start practicing mindfulness there. Watch out, people on the tram. I'm coming after you. I'm gonna be like mindfully watching you. All right. So thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. It's been such a pleasure talking to you about this. I've learned just like a vast amount of information about mindfulness that I haven't really done before with other mindfulness coaches. No offense. You guys taught other things that I was also very important, but now would be a perfect time to go into the open mic segment. And this is where you can talk about anything that you're passionate about, and it doesn't have to be related to the topic. So the floor is entirely yours. Take it away.
I have nothing comes to mind, to be honest. But there's one thing that I would like to share is that we often underestimate the power of awareness, because awareness is like, let me illustrate this. Now, you're possibly in a space where there is light. Now, in this room where you are in, or the space where you're in, just look around all the objects that your eyes could report. Now, it could be maybe a cup on the table, a remote control, the microphone, the keyboards, books, CDs, etc. Right? You are looking at all of this. If I were to ask you, what are the objects that you are noticing in this room? It is likely that you would be reporting all of these things in your room or in the space where you are in. But there is one thing that we are unlikely to report, which is the light in the room. We take the light for granted. But without the light, we would not be able to notice any of these objects in that space. So we take that light for granted. Now, this same phenomenon happens in our mind. When I ask people, what is it that you're noticing? I'm noticing thoughts. I'm noticing emotions. I'm noticing urges. I'm noticing discomfort, sensations, and all of that. But nobody talks about the awareness that lights up all of these experiences. We take awareness for granted. Without awareness, the emotions without awareness, I will not be aware of emotions. Without awareness, I will not be aware of thoughts, sensations, and urges. But we take that awareness for granted. That awareness is to put it in a mathematical model, the awareness is like the common denominator of every experience. But we are obsessed with the numerators in the fraction. We tend not to look at awareness at all. So if I were to share one thing, it's an invitation to notice that common denominator in all your experiences, which is awareness itself. And then you would discover a new aspect. You're likely, it's possible, because I'm not giving you any promise or guarantee, right? That's not my role. But there is a possibility, there is an opportunity for you to discover an aspect of yourself that you have taken for granted all your life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. I love how like literary, but also mathematical you were with that. And hopefully people will be able to understand. I know that math isn't a strong suit for many people, but we're going to hope that, that came across just well enough. Thank you so much, Kathirasan, for joining us today. If our listeners want to find out more about you and what you do, where can they go?
Yeah, you can visit my websites. I believe you might probably find the websites in the description of this particular video or audio that you're listening or watching. Otherwise, you could just Google my name, Kathirasan K, and that would usually land on, I'm not sure what the Google search results would be, but it's likely to land on my LinkedIn page or my Center for Mindfulness page, and also my personal page, which is kathirasank.com. So yeah, reach out to me via any of these platforms that you land on, and that would be probably the right way to get in touch with you.
Amazing. We will look for those links and we'll put them in the show note for sure. So if you're interested, do look there. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode. You have been listening to Aging Less, the Longevity Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website at longevity.lifemanagementsciencelabs.com, where you can join our movement. I'm Marie Stella. Thanks for tuning in.